Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Early Days by Miss Reed. We are having an exploration of her grandparents' house in London. The next floor comprised Uncle Harry's little room, a fair-sized landing, and the main bedroom over the drawing room, which Aunt Rose and Aunt Jess shared. There was a large bay window from which Aunt Jess hung to cut the pyracanthes branches for me. The walls were pink and the paintwork of a light color, but to me the chief attraction was the gas burner, which swiveled out from the wall on a brass bracket. When lit, the flame was shaped like a fishtail, blue in the middle and flaring yellow at the edges. Aunt Jess heated her hair tongs in this and curled her fringe in various stray ends to the accompaniment of much blue smoke and a strong smell of singeing. The bay window looked across Hither Green Lane to the trees which surrounded a hospital, known as the Fever Hospital. I don't think I ever saw the building itself, but its trees were very pleasant to look upon over the wooden fence. The room always seemed to get a good deal of sunshine and was probably the lightest room in that rather dark house. Up the last flight of stairs lay Aunt Jess's workroom and, above Grandma's, a nice square bedroom which looked out over the garden. This was the spare room and always seemed to be in use either by older cousins, a visiting married aunt, or simply by the overflow of Aunt Jess's work, which might be spread out ready-tacked for someone's fitting, either on the white counterpane or draped over the brass bed rail. I believe there were attics above these two rooms, for I vaguely remember a trap door in the ceiling at the head of these stairs, but I was never lucky enough to explore beyond these limits. In any case, by the time one had pounded up all those stairs behind Aunt Jess, 3-year-old legs were quite tired enough. Sometimes I could persuade Aunt Jess to cooperate with me in a delightful game with the bells which still operated in every room of the house. These had a white china handle and were fixed beside the various fireplaces. By giving them a half-turn, a pleasant jangling sound could be heard in the distance. A box hung outside the kitchen door near the door to the cellar, and here the bells rang cheerfully and indicated which room needed attention. I preferred ringing the bells, rushing from room to room, but if Aunt Jess could be prevailed upon to do this, which was not often, I was very content to study the result outside the kitchen door. Altogether, it was a fascinating house for a young child to explore, but its chief attraction, I now see as I look back, was the affection with which my sister and I were surrounded. Grandma Reed, Aunt Rose, Aunt Jess, and Uncle Harry were all busy people, but each of them could spare time and love for us. A sad ending. When the war was over, my mother, never very strong, had to undergo surgery. In 1921, we moved farther out into the country so that she would be in the healthy surroundings of the North Downs. It was a summer of extreme heat and drought, and the position of our new home on the heights gave no hint in those first glorious months of the sort of bitter cold which could be expected during the many winters we lived there. However, my mother rallied well and began to enjoy country pursuits such as gardening, cycling, and taking an active part in the local Women's Institute and the Glee Club, and later the church choir. Both she and my father sang well. Naturally, Grandma Reed, the aunts, and Uncle Harry were frequent visitors. My father reveled in this newfound freedom after 4 years of active service and the anxiety of my mother's illness, and enjoyed entertaining. The aunts were enthusiastic about the new home. I don't think Uncle Harry really took to it at all, but Grandma Reed was not much impressed. As a Londoner, she much preferred a landscape with figures, and on looking at the spectacular views which our windows commanded over some miles of rolling Kentish fields and woods, she shook her head sadly. "It's all much too green," she told my father, who relished the remark to the end of his days. Grandma Reed must have been around 75 when we moved away. She was still spry, still fond of her weekly trips to the cinema, and still blessed with beautiful dark hair. She had enjoyed good health throughout her life, despite the large family she had borne, and she dreaded becoming a burden to anyone, as she put it. Her father had lived with her until he died well on in his 90s, and perhaps the remembrance of all that had needed to be done for him accentuated her horror of being dependent upon her own children. It was a year or so after our move that she died. I had returned from a meeting of the local brownies one hot evening and was surprised to see my mother looking red-eyed and tremulous. She broke the news of Grandma's death to me as I demolished a late tea, and although I felt vaguely sad at the thought of not seeing her again, it seemed to me that anyone as old as Grandma Reed could not be expected to live much longer. My mother's grief seemed to be unnecessarily severe in the circumstances. It was some time afterwards that I learned that Grandma Reed, after a day or two's slight indisposition, had decided that she might, after all, become the burdens she had so feared to be, and ended her life at the age of 76 by taking poison. Grandma Scaife, Alice Scaife, née Bratt, 1860 to 1933. Grandma Scaife. My father's mother was a complete contrast in looks to Grandma Reed. She was considerably taller, was fair-skinned, and had a mass of fluffy white curls. She was also very large. Grandma Reed probably weighed about 7 stone. My guess is that Grandma Scaife probably tipped the scales at over 12. She dressed well and always looked beautifully turned out despite her bulk. I don't think that I ever saw her undressed, but her corsets must have been formidable. She favored lighter colors than Grandma Reed and wore mainly blues, grays, and purples. She had a number of toques, many with veiling over the face, and these sometimes matched the loose coats which reached her calves or ankles. The fashions beloved of the late Queen Mary, who was 7 years younger, were those which my Grandma Scaife followed and which suited her very well. She was a jolly person with round, merry eyes of gray and a wheezy laugh which was a good deal in evidence. She was particularly fond of my father, with whom she had much in common, and he was always able to amuse her to the point of reducing her to tears of delight as she fought for breath through her laughter. It was a very good thing that she had a sense of humor, for my grandfather had very little and had been a repressive father, but I will say more of Thomas Smith Scaife later. Many years afterward, when she was living with her daughter, Eva, Grandma Scaife was asked why on earth she had married him. The answer was poignant. "Well, dear, you see, I wasn't very happy at home." Surely this might stand as an epitaph to many unhappy marriages made when girls looked upon their weddings as the main aim in life. Nevertheless, she was a loyal and hard-working wife to the man of her choice, and her children adored her. She had been born Alice Batt in 1860, I think in London, but I know little about her parents. Certainly she had admirers, and with her gaiety and cheerful disposition, this was to be expected. One suitor she would have married, she said later, but her parents strongly disapproved, and she obeyed them. When or how she met Thomas Scaife, I do not know for sure, but I suspect that it was probably through the church. He was a good-looking young man, fair-haired and blue-eyed, very straight and slim. His looks probably attracted her, and his serious nature probably appealed to her parents, who no doubt were anxious to see their lively and attractive daughter settled with a responsible man. It is possible that she still secretly mourned the young man whom she had refused, but certainly she was still young, only 21, when she married Thomas Smith Scaife on Christmas Day in 1881. They set up a house in a respectable suburb in East London, possibly in Manor Park or Leytonstone, where there was a good public transport service to central London. Thomas was employed in a fairly responsible position at the post office in Mount Pleasant and traveled daily to his clerical work. They always rented houses until retirement, when they bought 17 New Pier Street at Walton-on-the-Naze in Essex, where I first remember them. Evidently, rented property suited them very well, and they had plenty of choice in those days. It was the habit of my grandfather to move somewhere in the eastern suburbs every 3 or 4 years when he felt that his present abode needed redecoration. The mind boggles at the thought of so many domestic upheavals, but evidently Grandma accepted them with her customary good humor. Thomas suffered severely from claustrophobia, as later my father did, and his family had chosen Walton-on-the-Naze as a suitable holiday center when he and his brother and sisters were young, because there were no tunnels to negotiate from the Liverpool Street station. Consequently, young Tom was fond of this little seaside resort, and it is not surprising that he kept up his visits to it and finally retired there in the early months of 1914. Summer 1914. Our first visit to the new home must have been in that fateful summer. My sister was then 4 years old and I 15 months. It was during this stay at Walton that the frontispiece photograph of us was taken. My sister is doing all that she has been told to do by the photographer. She has her legs crossed at the ankle, one hand supporting me, and a polite smile in evidence. On the contrary, I am being obstinate, but it is the photographer's fault entirely, as he has been trying to wrest my adored Teddy from me on the grounds that he was too shabby to be recorded for posterity. What utter snobbery! As you see, I am having no truck with such a despicable fellow, and refuse to cross my legs at the ankle, even if I could with that figure, or smile, and Teddy remains firmly in my grip. Our clothes are worth noting. We are wearing identical outfits of warm skirts and woolen high-necked jerseys, and very suitable summer wear, too, for playing on an East Coast beach with the icy North Sea pounding a few yards away. We got to know those splendid stretches of firm sand very well, but I can never remember finding them too hot. My father was an Army reservist, and so was called up at the outbreak of war on August 4th, to the Royal Horse Artillery. His 27th birthday was 2 days later, and he was in France very soon after that. I do not remember visiting my grandparents' new home whilst he was away at what was confusingly called the front. There seemed to be two fronts, one overseas, where my father was busy with guns and horses, and the other between our house and the gate into the road, where the path was tiled and London Pride and Privet grew. But later in the war years, either late 1917 or early 1918, my father came home, mercifully unharmed, and was posted to St. John's Wood, where he was an Army riding instructor. He took us as small children to see the stables and the horses he adored, and I was put on the back of one of those noble beasts. I screamed blue murder until I was rescued. My father, I feel sure, was more concerned about the horse's reaction to such a ghastly noise than about my fears, but I am thankful to say that I have never had to sit on a horse since that day. No doubt we visited my grandparents during that period, and certainly after the war it was our annual holiday place, and my main recollections of Grandma Scaife really begin when I was about 6 or 7 years of age. Unlike my Grandma Reed, who had a long family of 12 children, of which my mother was number 11, Grandma Scaife had only 4, as far as I know, and I heard of no sad infant deaths, which were such a common feature then of family life. The first was a boy named Frederick. He left home in his teens and eventually went to America, where he married and had a son called June, or so it is recorded in the family tree. Could he really be June? Or might he be Juan? Who knows? Anyway, with a Harleen on the maternal side of the family, it might as well be June. Frederick did not appear again. He and Grandpa had parted on frosty terms, I gather. My father was christened Arthur Gunnis Scaife and was the second son, born in 1887. Grandpa Scaife, who was longing for a daughter, was not very pleased, but evidently my father was a model baby, and judging by a photograph of him sitting up in a go-kart about age 18 months, in a very fetching white bonnet with a huge crown and a satin bow under the chin, he was a fine boy and already using the winning smile which made him so many friends when he was older. A year or two later, Grandma Scaife was again expecting a baby, and this time she sincerely hoped it would be a girl for Tom's sake. It was not. George Herbert Scaife duly appeared, and Grandpa was so disgusted that he refused to go upstairs to see the new baby. Poor Grandma. This little unwanted one grew up to be one of our favorite uncles. At last, in 1891, Grandma produced the Longford daughter, who was christened Eva. She was a beautiful child with the clear blue eyes of her father, and she grew into one of the handsomest women I ever met. She inherited her mother's energy and gaiety, was athletic, generous, and warm-hearted. It was Eva who took on the main responsibility of looking after her parents in the last years of their lives, and lived up to Thomas's ideal of the perfect daughter he had always wanted. There were no more children. Perhaps Grandma Scaife decided that to risk another son might be carrying things too far. 4 children were quite enough responsibility. Perhaps this is the moment to have a short account of Thomas Scaife's family. His father was William James Scaife, who was born in 1827 and who married in 1851 a girl called Emma Eliza Gunnis. My father's second name was Gunnis after his grandmother's maiden name. William and Emma had 4 children, a daughter named Emma Lydia, then my grandfather Thomas, another daughter Ada, followed in 1858, and the youngest child, called Edward James, was born in 1861. I was not destined to meet my great-aunts and great-uncles, although they all lived to ripe old age. The exception was Edward, whom I met when he was an elderly man approaching 70, and the circumstances were most unusual, but more of that later. We did not meet them for the simple reason that Thomas had left home as soon as he could and would have nothing to do with his family. Mind you, we only knew one side of the story, and the family may well have asked him to depart. He was always a difficult man, and I suspect that he had been a sore trial to his sisters and brother. He was quite sure that he was always right, was narrow-mindedly religious, relishing the taboos imposed by Victorian behavior, so that, as children, we were never allowed to play on the beach or read anything other than the prescribed holy books allowed by Grandpa on a Sunday. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy was a rule he tried to live by, and very trying it was to the rest of the household. I can't remember that cooking a substantial midday Sunday dinner came within this rule. Maybe women's work was exempt. His sons used to point out that he should not read the Monday edition of a newspaper, as men had certainly been employed to produce it on the Sabbath. But like so many obstinate people, Grandpa was able to bend the rules to suit himself. Smoking he abhorred, and I expect he had been censorious about this as a youth. My great-uncle Edward enjoyed a cigar in his later years, I recall. No doubt Brother Tom had pointed out that the downward path to hell awaited him as a smoker. A copy of the New Testament presented to me when I was about 8 years of age had a note in Grandpa's hand in the margin against the passage, "And he that is filthy, let him be filthy still," i.e. tobacco smokers, wrote my grandfather. There were other remarks of like nature aimed at enlightening the young mind, but that is the one which I most clearly remember. He had also scored across the pages showing St. Paul's journeys. The first journey had 1 line, the second 2, and the third had 3 lines, all beautifully ruled using a fine J nib. I think he enjoyed teaching. His mind was clear, his diction precise, and he was fond of his grandchildren so long as they were completely obedient and quiet. But there was nothing warm and happy about him, and the strict rules of behavior which he imposed upon himself, and tried to impose unsuccessfully as it turned out upon his family, gave him a wintry rectitude and a holier-than-thou attitude which made him very few friends. He was a lay preacher and spent a great deal of time in his study writing his discourses. There were hundreds of books. Spurgeon's sermons figured prominently, but to my infant eyes there was not a readable one among the lot. Not that we were encouraged to go into his study. Grandpa used it as his sanctum and probably dozed in there as often as he studied. This lay preaching was not something which he had taken up on retirement. Evidently, he had been interested in such things from early times, and my father used to enact a vivid imitation of Grandpa rapping on his study window, peering over the top of his spectacles, and calling out to his young sons in the garden, "Go away, you boys, go away," when the ball had bounced against the window and disturbed his train of thought. His Sundays must have been particularly irksome to his young family. Years later, when my sister and I used to stay there alone as children, the heavy hand of sabbatical stricture was still in evidence. In a drawer of his desk in the study, he kept about half a dozen paperbacked stories, which he considered suitable reading for a young child on a Sunday afternoon. Older people may remember some of these lugubrious effusions. The titles of those I remember were Froggy's Little Brother, Buy Your Own Cherries, and Christie's Old Organ, and they dealt with sanctimonious children, usually dying of some lingering disease, who engaged in very unchildlike pursuits such as saving drunken fathers or reuniting parted parents. All were written in mawkish prose, revolting to any normal child, and simply asking to be parodied. Luckily, my grandfather always retired again into his study after presenting us with our reading matter and impressing upon us the need to keep it clean. He probably had a nap. Grandma, as soon as the door was shut, relieved us of these dreadful books and substituted such welcome alternatives as a pile of Home Chat, a cheerful women's magazine in which we followed the adventures of a dear little black boy called Epaminondas with considerable relish. It occurs to me that such stories would now be banned as racist. All I can say is that Epaminondas did more to encourage a happy relationship between black and white children than any race relations board could do. Of course, if our parents were with us, we were spared the horrors of Grandpa's study Sunday observances and spent the day out of the house, either on the beach or in the shelter of Grandpa's beach hut. When I think of Grandpa Scaife now, I see him thin, clean-shaven, with very blue eyes, and dressed in his everyday retirement attire of a fine gray woolen roll-neck pullover and gray flannels to match. He liked to stand with his back to the fire, warming his bony hands behind him. Those fingers were devastatingly strong when it came to tickling his grandchildren's ribs, which he sometimes did when in an indulgent mood. He was always spruce and immaculately clean, and I think he loved us in his bleak way. You will hear more of this side of the family next time.